tape 042, and in this lesson we're going to determine what a proportion is and how to determine if a proportion is true or not, and then how to solve proportions when there are missing terms. A proportion is an expression that shows that two ratios are equal. A proportion can be written in three different ways. The fractional way is 1:3/4 is equal to the second ratio 15/20. Using the colon, it looks like this. 3/4, 3/4 is the same thing as 15/20. And as a phrase, 3:4 as works as our equals, 15:20. These are the three different ways the proportion can be written. There are two ways to determine if a proportion is true or not. One way is to determine if two ratios are proportional is to reduce each fraction. So if we put it in the fractional form, we can find out by reducing. Example, is 4/9 equal to 10/18? That's our question. So what we want to do is reduce the 4/9. Now 4/9 does not reduce, but 10/18 will reduce. What divides both of them? Okay. 2 divides both of them, so 2 into 10 gives me the 5, and 18 divided by 2 gives me 9. If we look at these, 4/9 and 5/9 are not equivalent. Therefore, 4/9 equals 10/18 is not a true proportion. We reduced them both, found they are not equivalent, therefore they are not a true proportion. In a proportion, A/B equals C/D. The values A and D are called the extremes of the proportion. This is something we need to know. A and D are called the extremes of the proportion. Notice when we say them, A is the first thing we say and D is the last thing we say. B and C are called the means of the proportion. Now remember, I told you there were two ways to check a proportion to see if it was true or not. One way was to reduce the fractions. The second way is to use the cross product test. The cross product test says that in a true proportion, the product of the means is equal to the product of the extremes. This is something we need to remember. This is a starred. This is something we need to have in our notes. Okay, the product of the means is equal to the product of the extremes. Now let's remember, product means multiply. Remember, the product means multiply. So given the proportion A/B equals C/D, if A times D is equal to B times C, then this is a true proportion. Okay, if we multiply A times D and set it equal to B times C, we get a true proportion if they're equivalent. This is also called cross multiplying. This is also called cross multiplying. Let's look at an example. Let's look at an example of cross product test. We want to determine whether ratios are proportional by using the cross products test. Given the proportion 5/8 equals 10/16, we want to determine if this is true or not. Okay. So we cross multiply. 5 times 16 is equal to 80. That's an 80. And 8 times 10 is equal to 80. Okay, the proportion is true because these values are equivalent. The product of the means is equal to the product of the extremes. The proportion is true. Let's look at an example with colons. If we have 62 to 4 is the same as 33 to 2. We want to know if this is true or not. So we want to multiply the means by the extremes. Multiply the means and see if it's equal to the extremes. So the extremes are 62 times 2, the outside values. 62 times 2, which is 124. And then we multiply the means. 44 times 33, and we get 132. These values are not the same. Since these values are not the same, we say the proportion is not true. This is a proportion that is not true. Let's try some practice problems. In the first example, I want you to determine whether the proportions are true by, if the proportion 39 over 48 equals 13 over 16 is true by reducing ratios to lowest terms. You want to do this by the first method we talked about. The second example, I want you to use the cross product test. It is 1/2 is to 6 is the same as 5 is to 60. I want to know if this proportion is true, but I want to use the cross products test. The third example is given in colon form. I want to know if the proportion 12 is to 14 as 45 is to 52 by using the cross products test. Okay, you need to pause the tape now and do these problems and then check your answers. If you have a question or had trouble with these, then you need to find a lab instructor or tutor to help you. These are the answers to the practice problems. The first one was true. If we reduced both of them, we came up with a true proportion. The second one also was true. Both the product of the means and the extremes was 30. The third one was not true. The product of the means and the product of the extremes were not equivalent. Now we want to look at solving proportions. This is when one member of our proportion is unknown. When we need a process used to do that. So this is the process that we need to do. This is a starred thing that we need to remember. We need to write this down. To solve a proportion or find the missing value, the first thing we want to do is set the cross products equal to each other. In other words, we want to set the product of the means equal to the product of the extremes. And we want to set the product of the extremes equal to the product of the means. The second thing we want to do is divide both sides by the number that's with the unknown. We're going to divide both sides by the number that's with the unknown.